The bustling main lobby of Metropolitan General Hospital was just starting to fill up with the usual morning crowd. The sun streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor as patients and staff members hurried about their day. Behind the main reception desk, Mrs. Patel, the newly appointed hospital manager, was reviewing the day's schedule while sipping her morning coffee. She had worked her way up from being a nurse's assistant to managing one of the city's largest hospitals, and she took immense pride in running a smooth professional operation. Every morning, she would make her rounds, greeting the staff with a warm smile and ensuring everything was in perfect order. The hospital had strict policies about maintaining a neutral, welcoming environment for patients from all walks of life, and Mrs. Patel was known for enforcing these rules fairly and consistently. On this particular Monday morning, something caught her attention. An elderly man had been sitting in the lobby for nearly an hour. He was dressed casually in faded jeans and a worn leather jacket, but what stood out was his bright red MAGA hat. Mrs. Patel noticed how some patients were taking longer routes to avoid passing near him, while others were whispering and pointing discreetly. Two elderly women had already approached the reception desk, expressing their discomfort. A young mother had redirected her children to sit on the opposite side of the waiting area. The tension in the lobby was becoming palpable, and Mrs. Patel knew she had to address the situation before it escalated. She straightened her navy blue blazer, took a deep breath, and walked over to where the man was sitting, flipping through an old magazine. Up close, she could see that despite his casual attire, his shoes were expensive Italian leather, and his watch looked like it cost more than her monthly salary. Still, rules were rules, and she had learned long ago not to judge situations by appearances. "Excuse me, sir," she said politely, maintaining her professional smile. "I'm the hospital manager. While we respect everyone's right to personal expression, we have a strict policy about politically charged attire in our facility. Would you mind removing your hat while you're here?" The man looked up slowly, his blue eyes twinkling with what seemed like amusement. He didn't appear angry or offended, which was a relief, but there was something about his calm demeanor that made Mrs. Patel slightly uneasy. "I'm quite comfortable with my hat on. Thank you," he replied pleasantly, his voice carrying a hint of authority that seemed at odds with his casual appearance. "I don't see how my choice of headwear affects anyone's medical care." Mrs. Patel could feel the eyes of patients and staff members on them. Her cheeks grew warm, but she stood her ground. "Sir, our policy exists to ensure all patients feel comfortable and safe while seeking medical care. I must insist that you either remove the hat or what?" he asked, still smiling, but with a slight edge to his voice. The situation was quickly becoming the very scene Mrs. Patel had hoped to avoid. Several people had stopped pretending not to listen and were now openly watching the exchange. A young nurse at the station was frantically typing something on her computer, throwing nervous glances their way. Mrs. Patel took another deep breath. In her 15 years of healthcare work, she had learned that sometimes the hardest part of the job was standing firm when faced with difficult patients or visitors. "Or I'll have to ask security to escort you out of the building, sir. I'm sure you understand that we must maintain our professional standards." The man closed his magazine deliberately slowly and placed it on the side table. He looked around the lobby, taking in the scene they had created, then back at Mrs. Patel. His face remained unreadable, but there was something in his expression that made her wonder if she had just made a terrible mistake. Little did she know, this seemingly routine morning interaction was about to change the course of her career in ways she couldn't possibly imagine. The tension in the hospital lobby was thick enough to cut with a scalpel. Mrs. Patel stood her ground as the elderly man in the MAGA hat slowly rose from his chair. He wasn't particularly tall, but something about his presence made everyone in the vicinity stop and stare. "I've been coming to this hospital for over 30 years, he said, his voice carrying across the now quiet lobby. "Never thought I'd see the day when my choice of hat would cause such a stir." He chuckled, but there wasn't much humor in it. Mrs. Patel felt her professional smile wavering. She'd handled difficult situations before. Angry patients, frustrated family members, even the occasional celebrity who thought rules didn't apply to them. But something about this man's confident demeanor made her second-guess herself. "Sir, I completely understand your position," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "But our policy exists to maintain a comfortable environment for everyone. Perhaps we could provide you with a different hat from the gift shop." She was trying to find a middle ground, something her years of experience had taught her was often the best solution. The man shook his head, adjusting his hat with deliberate slowness. "Young lady, do you know why I'm here today?" He didn't wait for her answer. "I'm here because this hospital saved my wife's life 20 years ago. I'm here because the doctors and nurses in this building have shown more dedication and professionalism than any other medical facility in this city." More people were gathering around now. A young intern who had been pushing a wheelchair stopped dead in his tracks. The receptionist had given up any pretense of working and was openly watching the scene unfold. "That's wonderful to hear, sir," Mrs. Patel responded, her throat feeling dry. "And we're honored to have served your family. However, the current situation." "The current situation," he interrupted, "is that you're asking me to change who I am to make others comfortable. Isn't the hospital supposed to treat everyone equally, regardless of their beliefs?" Mrs. Patel felt her face growing hot. She could see both sides of the argument, but policy was policy. "Sir, this isn't about treating people differently. It's about maintaining a neutral environment where everyone can receive care without distraction or discomfort." The man's eyes twinkled again, but this time there was something else there. Was it respect? "And if I refuse to remove my hat?" Mrs. Patel straightened her spine. This was the moment of truth. "Then I'll have no choice but to ask security to escort you out." She gestured to the security guard who had already started walking their way, probably drawn by the growing crowd. The man looked at the approaching security guard, then back at Mrs. Patel. To everyone's surprise, he smiled. A genuine, warm smile that transformed his entire face. "You know what? I respect that. You're standing up for what you believe is right, even though it's uncomfortable." Despite his kind words, Mrs. Patel knew what had to be done. She nodded to the security guard, who had now reached them. The guard, a middle-aged man named Mr. Thompson, who had worked at the hospital for over a decade, stepped forward hesitantly. "Sir, please come with me," Mr. Thompson said, his voice professional but gentle. The elderly man nodded, still smiling. As he turned to leave, he looked back at Mrs. Patel one last time. "You're doing your job, and you're doing it well. But remember, sometimes things aren't exactly what they seem." As security led him toward the exit, Mrs. Patel couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something important. The crowd began to disperse, and the usual hustle and bustle of hospital life resumed, but there was an undercurrent of whispers and speculation. A young nurse rushed up to Mrs. Patel, her eyes wide. "Ma'am, you might want to check your email. There's an important board meeting this afternoon, and—" She hesitated, glancing at the doors where the man had just exited. "Well, you might want to see who's on the attendance list." Mrs. Patel's stomach dropped. Something in the nurse's tone made her realize that her day was about to get much more complicated. Mrs. Patel's fingers trembled slightly as she unlocked her office computer. The morning's events kept replaying in her mind as she clicked open her email. The nurse's worried expression had said it all. Something big was coming. As her eyes scanned the board meeting attendee list, her heart nearly stopped. There, listed among the hospital's top executives, was a name that made everything click into place. Robert Maxwell, owner and chairman of the board. Below his name was a small photo, and Mrs. Patel felt her stomach drop. It was him, the same man she had just kicked out of the lobby. She leaned back in her chair, feeling like all the air had been sucked out of the room. The expensive watch, the confident demeanor, the way he'd mentioned his 30-year connection to the hospital. It all made perfect sense now. She'd just escorted the owner of the hospital out of his own building. The clock on her wall seemed to tick louder than usual as she considered her options. She could resign before the board meeting and save herself the embarrassment. She could prepare a defense of her actions. After all, she had just been following hospital policy. Or she could face whatever was coming head-on. A knock on her office door made her jump. "Come in," she called out, trying to keep her voice steady. Her assistant poked his head in, looking concerned. "The board meeting's been moved up," he said quietly. "They want everyone in the main conference room in 15 minutes." Mrs. Patel nodded, her mouth too dry to speak. As her assistant closed the door, she opened her desk drawer and pulled out her small emergency makeup kit. If she was going down, she would at least look professional doing it. The walk to the conference room felt like the longest of her life. Every person she passed seemed to be whispering, their eyes following her with a mix of pity and curiosity. News traveled fast in hospitals, and by now, everyone probably knew what had happened. Outside the conference room, she took a deep breath and smoothed down her blazer. Through the glass walls, she could see the board members already seated. And there he was, Mr. Maxwell, sitting at the head of the table, still wearing that MAGA hat. As she entered the room, the quiet chatter died down. Several board members avoided eye contact, while others watched her with open interest. Mr. Maxwell, however, smiled warmly and gestured to an empty seat near him. "Mrs. Patel, please join us," he said, his voice carrying the same friendly tone from earlier. "We have quite a bit to discuss." She sat down, her back straight, preparing herself for what was to come. The room was silent except for the gentle hum of the air conditioning. "I believe most of you have heard about this morning's incident in the lobby," Mr. Maxwell began, looking around the table. "Our hospital manager here had me escorted out of the building for refusing to remove my hat." He paused, and Mrs. Patel felt her chest tighten. "And I couldn't be more pleased," he finished, surprising everyone in the room. Mrs. Patel blinked, sure she had misheard him. Around the table, other board members looked equally confused. "You see," Mr. Maxwell continued, removing his hat and placing it on the table, "I've been concerned lately about whether our policies were being enforced equally, regardless of a person's status or position. So I decided to test it myself." He turned to face Mrs. Patel directly. "And you, Mrs. Patel, passed with flying colors." The tension in her shoulders began to ease slightly, but she remained cautious. Mr. Maxwell leaned forward, addressing the entire room but keeping his eyes on her. "Today, I saw exactly what I want to see in our leadership. Someone who stands up for our hospital's principles, even when it's difficult. Even when it means confronting someone they think might be powerful." He smiled again, and this time, Mrs. Patel felt herself starting to breathe normally again. But something told her this meeting was far from over, and Mr. Maxwell's next words confirmed it. "Now," he said, his eyes twinkling with that same look from earlier, "let's talk about your promotion." The conference room fell completely silent. Mrs. Patel gripped the arms of her chair, wondering if she had heard correctly. Promotion? Just minutes ago, she'd been mentally updating her resume, and now Mr. Maxwell was talking about advancing her career. "I can see I surprised you," Mr. Maxwell said, clearly enjoying the moment. "But let me explain why this morning's incident confirmed what I've suspected for months, that you're exactly the kind of leader this hospital needs." He stood up and began walking around the table, his expensive shoes clicking against the polished floor. "You see, every month I receive reports about how well this hospital is running. The numbers are impressive. Patient satisfaction up, waiting times down, staff morale improving. But numbers only tell part of the story." Mrs. Patel watched as he paused by the large window overlooking the hospital grounds. The morning sun cast his shadow long across the conference room floor. "What I wanted to know," he continued, "was whether these improvements were just surface-level changes, or if they reflected a deeper commitment to our values. So I decided to put it to the test. I showed up dressed casually, wearing something I knew would create a stir. One of the board members, an older woman with silver hair, leaned forward. "You deliberately caused a disruption in our hospital." Mr. Maxwell nodded. "I did, and I watched how different staff members reacted. Some pretended not to notice me. Others whispered behind their hands but did nothing. A few even recognized me and suddenly became overly friendly, despite my provocative attire." He turned back to face Mrs. Pottle. "But you? You saw a situation that might make patients uncomfortable, and you addressed it head-on. You were polite but firm. You offered alternatives. And most importantly, you stuck to our policies even when faced with resistance." Mrs. Patel felt her cheeks warm at the praise, but something still bothered her. "Sir, if I may," she began hesitantly. "Please, speak freely," Mr. Maxwell encouraged. "While I appreciate your words, I'm concerned about how my actions this morning affected our patients and staff. The scene we created in the lobby." Mr. Maxwell's face broke into a broad grin. "And that right there is exactly why you're perfect for this position. Even now, your first thought is about the impact on our hospital community." He returned to his seat and pulled out a folder from his briefcase. "The position of Chief Operations Officer has been vacant for 2 months now. We've interviewed dozens of candidates from across the country. But what we needed wasn't someone with the fanciest degree or the most impressive resume. We needed someone who truly understands and believes in our mission." The room buzzed with quiet murmurs as other board members nodded in agreement. Mrs. Patel felt slightly dizzy. Chief Operations Officer. It was a jump of several levels from her current position. "Now," Mr. Maxwell said, opening the folder, "let's discuss the details. The role would involve overseeing all hospital operations, implementing new policies, and ensuring our values are maintained at every level. Based on what I saw today, I believe you're more than capable." Mrs. Patel straightened in her chair, her mind racing. This was an incredible opportunity, but also an enormous responsibility. "Mr. Maxwell, I'm honored, but I have to ask, what about the hat incident? Won't that set a strange precedent?" He laughed warmly. "On the contrary, it's going to become part of our training program. Your handling of the situation will serve as a perfect example of how to maintain professional standards while treating everyone with respect." The meeting continued, but Mrs. Patel found herself thinking about all the times in her career when she'd stood up for what she believed was right, even when it was difficult. Each of those moments had led her here, to this unexpected opportunity. As Mr. Maxwell began outlining her potential new responsibilities, she couldn't help but smile at the irony. The very incident she thought would end her career had instead launched it to new heights. Sometimes, she realized, doing the right thing paid off in ways you could never expect. The next few days at Metropolitan General were a whirlwind of activity. Word of the MAGA hat incident had spread through the hospital like wildfire, but not in the way Mrs. Patel had initially feared. Instead of being seen as a career-ending mistake, it had become something of an inspiring story among the staff. She was walking through the pediatric ward, doing her usual morning rounds, when she overheard 2 nurses discussing it in hushed, excited tones. "Can you believe it?" one whispered. She stood up to the owner without even knowing who he was. Mrs. Patel pretended not to hear, but she couldn't help smiling. The incident had sparked something unexpected in the hospital's culture. Staff members seemed more confident about enforcing policies, regardless of who was involved. During her lunch break, she sat in the hospital cafeteria, picking at her salad while reviewing the paperwork for her new position. The promotion wasn't just a title change, it came with significant responsibilities. She would be overseeing operations for the entire hospital system, including 3 smaller satellite clinics. A young doctor dropped into the seat across from her, clutching a coffee cup. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, looking nervous, "but I wanted to thank you. Yesterday, I had to tell a local politician's wife that she couldn't skip the waiting line in the ER. I kept thinking about what you did, and it gave me the courage to stand my ground. Mrs. Patel put down her fork, touched by his words. You did the right thing, she assured him. Every patient deserves the same level of care and respect, regardless of who they are. As the doctor left, Mr. Maxwell appeared, carrying his own lunch tray. This time, he wasn't wearing the controversial hat. Mind if I join you? He asked, already pulling out a chair. Of course not, she replied, quickly gathering her papers to make space. It was still strange, sitting casually with the hospital's owner, but she was gradually getting used to it. I've been hearing good things, he said, unwrapping his sandwich. Seems like your actions have inspired quite a few people around here. Mrs. Patel nodded thoughtfully. It's made me realize something important. Sometimes, what looks like a small decision can have a big impact on others. Mr. Maxwell wiped his hands with a napkin and leaned back in his chair. That's exactly why I did what I did. You know, I've owned this hospital for 15 years, and I've seen many managers come and go. Some were brilliant with numbers, others were great with paperwork, but few truly understood what makes a hospital work. And what's that? Mrs. Patel asked, genuinely curious. Consistency, he replied. Treating everyone the same way, whether they're a janitor or a CEO. That's what you showed me in the lobby that day. A group of medical students walked past their table, trying not to stare too obviously at the unusual sight of the hospital owner and the soon-to-be CEO sharing lunch. I have to ask, Mrs. Patel said, gathering her courage. Why the MAGA hat? You could have tested me in many ways. Mr. Maxwell's eyes twinkled. Because it was perfect for my purpose. It's something that provokes strong reactions, making it an excellent test of professional behavior. Plus, he chuckled, nobody would expect the hospital's owner to walk around wearing one. As they finished their lunch, Mrs. Patel's phone buzzed with meeting reminders. Her new role would officially start next week, and there was still so much to prepare. One last thing, Mr. Maxwell said as they stood up. The hat's in my office, framed. I'm thinking of hanging it in the hospital's main hall with a plaque. Sometimes doing the right thing means standing up to the boss. What do you think? Mrs. Patel laughed, shaking her head. Maybe we should just include the story in our training manual instead. As she walked back to her office, she realized that this whole experience had taught her something valuable. Principles aren't just words on paper. They're choices we make every day, even when those choices are difficult. The morning of Mrs. Patel's first official day as Chief Operations Officer started with an unexpected announcement. Mr. Maxwell had called an all-staff meeting in the hospital's main auditorium. People filed in, whispering among themselves, wondering what was going on. The large room was packed, with staff members from every department. Doctors still in their white coats, nurses in scrubs, maintenance workers in their uniforms, and administrative staff in their business attire. The mix of colors and uniforms showed just how many different people it took to keep a hospital running. Mr. Maxwell stood at the podium, looking out over the crowd. The famous MAGA hat was sitting on the podium beside him, but he wasn't wearing it. Mrs. Patel sat in the front row, her heart beating faster than usual. Good morning, everyone, Mr. Maxwell began, his voice carrying through the speakers. I've called you all here because I want to share something important about leadership and courage. Many of you have heard about what happened in our lobby last week. Some of you were there. Others have heard different versions of the story. He picked up the hat, turning it in his hands. This hat became famous in our hospital for an unexpected reason. It wasn't about politics, it was about principles. The room was completely silent now, everyone leaning forward slightly, eager to hear the full story from the man himself. You see, I've visited many hospitals over the years. Some run smoothly on the surface, but dig deeper and you find that rules only apply to certain people. Others claim to have strong values, but those values crumble when faced with power or money. He gestured toward Mrs. Pottle. Last week, your new COO didn't know who I was when she asked me to follow our hospital's policy. She treated me exactly the same way she would treat anyone else. That's the kind of leadership we need. Mrs. Patel felt hundreds of eyes turned toward her, but for once she didn't feel uncomfortable under the attention. She sat straighter, proud of what her actions represented. Mr. Maxwell continued, "From today, we're launching what we call the Equal Treatment Initiative. Every patient, every visitor, every staff member will be treated with the same respect and held to the same standards. No exceptions." He held up a stack of papers. "These are our updated policies. They're not really new. They're the same principles Mrs. Patel upheld that day. We're just making them clearer and ensuring everyone understands that they apply to everyone, from the cleaning staff to me." A young maintenance worker raised his hand. Mr. Maxwell nodded, encouraging him to speak. "Sir," the worker said, his voice slightly shaky, "does this mean we can actually say something if we see someone breaking the rules, even if they're important?" Mr. Maxwell smiled. "Not only can you say something, you must say something. That's what this is all about. Every person in this building plays a vital role in maintaining our standards." He turned to face different sections of the audience. "Whether you're performing surgery, changing bed sheets, fixing equipment, or managing staff, your job matters. And part of your job is ensuring our hospital remains a place where everyone feels respected and safe." The maintenance worker nodded, sitting back with a small smile. Around the room, people were exchanging glances and nods of approval. "Now," Mr. Maxwell said, placing the hat in a glass display case next to the podium, "this will be displayed in our main hall. Not as a political statement, but as a reminder that doing the right thing isn't about who someone is or what position they hold. It's about treating everyone with equal respect and dignity." As the meeting ended and people began filing out, the buzz of conversation filled the air. Mrs. Patel overheard snippets of excited discussion, people talking about times they'd wanted to speak up but hadn't felt empowered to do so. A nurse stopped by her chair. "You've changed things around here," she said quietly. "For the better." Before Mrs. Patel could respond, the nurse had disappeared into the crowd. Looking at the hat in its display case, Mrs. Patel realized that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest acts of courage. 3 weeks had passed since the all-staff meeting, and the changes at Metropolitan General were becoming more noticeable every day. Mrs. Patel sat in her new office, reading through the morning reports with a sense of pride. The Equal Treatment Initiative was having effects that nobody had expected. Just yesterday, a wealthy businessman had tried to jump the emergency room queue by offering money to the staff. The young receptionist, who would have once felt pressured to comply, politely but firmly explained that all patients were seen based on medical priority, not financial status. When the businessman demanded to speak to someone in charge, he was surprised to find both Mrs. Patel and Mr. Maxwell backing up the receptionist's decision. A knock on her office door interrupted her thoughts. It was one of the cleaning staff, looking nervous but determined. "Ma'am, do you have a minute?" he asked, fidgeting with his uniform cap. "Of course," Mrs. Patel replied, gesturing to a chair. "Please, sit down." The man perched on the edge of the chair. "It's about the VIP wing," he began. "I've noticed that some visitors are bringing food to patients despite the nil by mouth signs. The nurses seem hesitant to stop them because they're from influential families. In the past, such information might have been ignored. But now, Mrs. Patel immediately picked up her phone and called a meeting with the head nurse of that wing. This was exactly the kind of situation their new policy was designed to address. Later that afternoon, Mr. Maxwell stopped by during his usual rounds. He'd made it a habit to walk through different departments regularly, talking to staff at all levels. Today, he was carrying a newspaper. "Have you seen this?" he asked, dropping the paper on her desk. The headline read, Local hospitals' revolutionary approach to equal treatment makes waves in healthcare community. Mrs. Patel picked up the paper, scanning the article. It described how Metropolitan General's new policy was challenging traditional hospital hierarchies and creating a more accountable healthcare environment. We've had calls from 3 other hospital networks, Mr. Maxwell said, sitting down. They want to know more about our initiative. Apparently, we're starting a trend. Mrs. Patel shook her head in amazement. All this from one incident with a hat. No, Mr. Maxwell corrected her. All this from one person who was willing to do the right thing, even when it was difficult. The hat was just a prop. You were the catalyst. Just then, her computer pinged with a new email. It was the monthly patient satisfaction survey results. As she opened the report, her eyes widened. Our numbers are up by 15%, she said, scrolling through the data. Patients are reporting that they feel more secure knowing everyone is treated the same way. Mr. Maxwell smiled. Read the staff's satisfaction numbers. She clicked to the next page and gasped. Employee satisfaction had jumped by 23%. The comments section was filled with positive feedback about feeling empowered to enforce policies fairly. You know what the best part is? Mr. Maxwell asked, leaning forward in his chair. Yesterday, I forgot my visitor's badge when I came in through the side entrance. The new security guard stopped me and insisted I go back to the front desk to get one. When I told him who I was, he politely said, I understand, sir, but rules are rules. I've never been prouder. Mrs. Patel laughed. The story would certainly make its way around the hospital by tomorrow, further reinforcing their message. As the day wound down, she walked through the main hall, passing the now famous hat in its display case. A group of medical students had stopped to read the plaque beneath it. The incident had become part of the hospital's culture, a reminder that integrity wasn't just a word on a mission statement. It was something you proved through actions, big and small, every single day. One of the students turned to her. Is it true? She asked. Did you really kick out the owner without knowing who he was? Mrs. Patel smiled. I did what any of you would do. I followed our policies. Because in a hospital, everyone deserves the same respect and treatment, no matter who they are. 6 months had passed, and Metropolitan General Hospital had become something of a healthcare industry legend. Mrs. Patel was reviewing the latest round of changes in her office when her assistant rushed in with exciting news. We've been selected, he exclaimed, waving a letter. The National Healthcare Association wants us to present our Equal Treatment Initiative at their annual conference. They're calling it a revolutionary approach to hospital management. Mrs. Patel took the letter, reading it with growing amazement. The conference was the biggest healthcare management event of the year. Hospital administrators and medical professionals from across the country would be there. Mr. Maxwell's already confirmed he'll join you for the presentation, her assistant added. And yes, he's bringing the hat. She couldn't help but laugh. That hat, now safely displayed in the main hall, had become their unofficial symbol of change. Tour groups from other hospitals would often stop to take pictures of it, amazed that such a simple incident had sparked such significant changes. Later that day, during her regular walk through the hospital wings, she noticed something that made her stop. A young doctor was explaining to a well-dressed couple why their relative needed to wait their turn for an MRI scan, despite their family's connections to the hospital board. I understand your concerns, the doctor was saying, his voice calm and confident. But we have a strict policy of scheduling based on medical necessity. It's what makes our hospital special. Everyone gets the same high standard of care, regardless of who they are. Mrs. Patel smiled to herself and continued walking. 6 months ago, that same doctor might have felt pressured to make an exception. Now, enforcing fair treatment had become second nature to the staff. In the cafeteria, she overheard 2 nurses discussing a situation from the morning. A famous local athlete had come in for treatment and expected special attention. Instead of creating chaos, The staff had simply followed their standard procedures. Remember how it used to be. One nurse said to the other. We'd all panic when someone important came in. Now it's just normal. Everyone follows the same rules. Mr. Maxwell joined her for lunch, bringing news of his own. You won't believe this, he said, sitting down with his tray. 3 more hospital networks have adopted our policy. They're calling it the Metropolitan Method. Mrs. Patel nearly choked on her coffee. The Metropolitan Method. Apparently, we're trending in healthcare management circles, he chuckled. But here's the best part. Remember that businessman who tried to bribe his way through the ER last month? She nodded, wondering where this was going. He just made a huge donation to the hospital. Said he was impressed by how we refused to give him special treatment. Can you believe it? People actually respect us more because we don't give them special privileges. As they finished lunch, a maintenance worker approached their table. 6 months ago, this would have been unheard of. Staff approaching the owner during his lunch. But times had changed. Sir, ma'am, he said politely, we found some issues with the ventilation system in the East Wing. Usually, we'd wait to report it through proper channels, but your speak-up policy made me think I should tell you directly. Mr. Maxwell immediately pulled out his phone to make a note. Thank you for bringing this to our attention. This is exactly the kind of initiative we want to see. After the maintenance worker left, Mrs. Patel reflected on how much had changed. The hospital felt different now, more open, more honest, more fair. Staff at all levels felt empowered to speak up, and patients knew they would receive the same high standard of care regardless of their status. As she headed back to her office to prepare for the upcoming conference presentation, she passed the famous hat in its display case. A new group of medical interns was gathered around it, listening to their supervisor tell the story. And that's why we do things differently here, the supervisor was saying. Because one day, someone decided to stand up for what was right, not knowing who she was standing up to. And that changed everything. The National Healthcare Conference's main hall was packed with thousands of medical professionals, all eager to hear about the Metropolitan Method. Mrs. Patel stood backstage, taking deep breaths to calm her nerves. Mr. Maxwell stood beside her, holding the now famous MAGA hat. Ready to make history, he asked with a warm smile. Just tell them the truth. That's all they need to hear. As they walked onto the stage, the bright lights momentarily blinded her. Looking out at the sea of faces, she saw hospital administrators, doctors, nurses, and healthcare workers from across the country. All here to learn how one small incident had transformed an entire hospital. Good morning, she began, her voice steady despite her racing heart. A year ago, I thought I'd made the biggest mistake of my career. I kicked the owner of my hospital out of his own building. The audience laughed, and she felt herself relax. But that mistake turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to our hospital. Not because it got me promoted, though it did. More laughter. But because it showed us something important. Principles only matter when they apply to everyone. Mr. Maxwell stepped forward, holding up the hat. This hat, he said, became a symbol at our hospital. Not for its political message, but for what it taught us about courage and fairness. Together, they shared stories from the past year. The wealthy businessman who became a donor because they wouldn't give him special treatment. The maintenance worker who felt empowered to report safety concerns directly to management. The young doctor who stood up to a board member's family about waiting their turn. But the real change, Mrs. Patel continued, wasn't in these big moments. It was in the small, everyday decisions. The receptionist who treats every patient the same way, whether they arrive in a luxury car or on foot. The nurse who enforces visiting hours even when a patient's relative is a local celebrity. The security guard who asks the hospital owner to show his ID badge. The audience nodded in recognition. These were challenges every hospital faced. Our patient satisfaction scores have risen by 30% over the past year, Mr. Maxwell added. Staff turnover is down by 40%. And here's the surprising part. Our efficiency has improved because we're not constantly making exceptions for VIPs. During the question and answer session, a hospital director from another state raised his hand. "This all sounds wonderful," he said, "but weren't you worried about losing important donors or influential patients?" Mrs. Patel smiled. "Actually, we gained more than we lost. People respect consistency. When they see that everyone truly is treated the same way, they trust us more, even if it sometimes means they have to wait their turn." After the presentation, dozens of healthcare professionals crowded around them, eager to learn more. But what touched Mrs. Patel most was a conversation with a young nurse from a small rural hospital. "Thank you," the nurse said quietly. "Tomorrow, when someone tries to skip the line or bend the rules, I'll think of your story, and I'll have the courage to say no." On the flight home, Mr. Maxwell turned to Mrs. Patel. "You know, when I put on that hat that morning, I thought I was just testing one manager's integrity. I never imagined we'd end up changing the entire healthcare industry." Mrs. Patel looked out the airplane window, thinking about how far they'd come. "Sometimes the smallest choices have the biggest impacts," she replied. "All it takes is one person willing to do the right thing." Back at Metropolitan General, the hat still sits in its display case, reminding everyone that true leadership isn't about power or position. It's about having the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult. And sometimes, what seems like a career-ending mistake can turn out to be the beginning of something remarkable. The end.